Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer here at UC Merced. I use she, her pronouns. From my brief time with our speaker today, I know you guys are in for a really amazing dialogue and engagement. Thank you for being here, but I really want to express my gratitude to the Chancellor Advisory Committee on Queer Issues. I'm going to drop their link in the chat so you all can get involved. But thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to the moderators, Professors Margaret and Gut.
Yeah, thanks so much. So we're super excited to have William Johnson joining us today. A quick bio for William. So William's a Brooklyn-based essayist, cultural critic, and editor. He's the deputy director of Lambda Literary. Lambda Literary is an organization committed to nurturing and advocating for LGBTQ writers, elevating the impact of their words to create community, preserve their legacies, and affirm the value of their stories and their lives. He's also a writer himself, so his writings appeared in numerous art catalogs and periodicals. Boy Book, a pictorial study of urban male nudes in a contemporary urban setting. A Question of Beauty, works by Anika Wilson. And I Knew It Was Your Arm, works by Doug Group. He's also a contributing arts and culture writer for CrushFanazine. And today he's joining us from Wisconsin, and we're super excited to hear him talk about queer struggle, queer excellence, queer joy, and literature. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you, thank you. Greetings from Milwaukee, everyone. So I live in Brooklyn, but I'm visiting family in Milwaukee, so I've been here for about a month. So greetings from the Dairy State, and thank you all for having me. I am going to start off with, I'm just telling you a little bit about Lambda, what we do and who we are. And then I'm going to move into a little bit of history around LGBTQ literature, and also talk about, where we are at right now. So first, Lambda was formed in 1987 with the mission of elevating and centering LGBT writers and readers. And currently we do that through several programs. Our most well-known program is the Lambda Literary Awards, which happens every June. This year, it will probably be virtual, but it honors the best in LGBTQ literature in that given year. We are Big Tent, so our categories range from everything from LGBT, lesbian romance, gay romance, to trans poetry, to gay fiction, to lesbian fiction. We also have a writer's retreat, which is sort of like a master class that happens every August. In the past, it was at Otis School of the Arts in LA. This year, we will figure out where it's going to be. Next year, we'll figure out where it's going to be. It will probably be virtual. But this is an opportunity for emerging writers to have a master class with some of the best writers in our community. Past faculty have included Dorothy Allison, Justin Torres, Garth Greenwell, Dinez Smith, and the workshops encompass everything from, there's a poetry workshop, a YA workshop, a nonfiction workshop, a playwriting workshop, and there's 12 students per workshop, and the faculty pick their applicants to join them. We also have a Writers in Schools program, which is based in New York City, where we bring YA writers into classrooms to talk about queer writing and to pass out books with students. And that goes everywhere from elementary to high school. And that is, I think, probably one of our most dynamic programs, because it really helps students engage with queer literature, and it centers queer literature within the public school system, which is a rarity. We also have a website which does reviews and interviews and opinion pieces, and I'll put that in the chat. That's where we are. We're at lambdaliterary.org. We also have, other than just reviews and opinion pieces, there is also call for submissions we post. That's writing opportunities for queer writers who want to submit their work to either journals or contests. So that is what Lambda does. Now, I want to start off with really talking about kind of the history of queer literature. And history is a strange thing. I understand that, lineage is important, but it's also important to realize that certain histories are not elevated, particularly when it comes to queer history. But I do think we can draw out flashpoints that are important, that kind of can help us understand where we're at with queer literature right now, and also kind of understand how Lambda came to be. And I'm also going to dovetail a little bit about my own personal interaction with queer literature. So, queer literature has been around forever. I mean, we can look back at the Greek myths, Zeus, Apollo, Poseidon, Hercules. They were all involved in some sorts of same-sex intimacies. In 630 BC, we had Sappho writing Greek poems around her same-sex love. In the 20s, you had Radcliffe, who wrote a lesbian-centered story, The Well of Loneliness. In 1933, you had Lily Ellie write a memoir that was released after her death about her transition, which was called Man into Woman. This was in 1933. But what I want to do right now is kind of do a little bit of a time machine to go back to talk about kind of this contemporary moment and some of the things that led to it. So I'm going to take us back to, I think, what's the date we're looking at? 1958, which I like to consider a pivotal moment in our contemporary relationship with LGBT literature. There was an organization called Mattachine, which was, the formation started in 1948 by a guy named Harry Hayes, who was actually inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous, believe it or not. He wanted to have a group for gay men called Bachelors Anonymous. And this idea grew popular with his group of friends. But instead of really talking about maintaining any sense of sobriety around gay sex, it was really about a support group around living in your true self. So Mattachine grew to become a larger organization, and they actually started publishing a magazine called One Ink. And One Ink had stories, it had articles, and you could write to the folks at Mattachine to actually get a copy of One magazine. But in 1958, the Los Angeles Postmaster General, his name was Otto Olson, declared that one issue of the of One was obscene, lewd, and filthy. And he said in 1954 that he said this was unmailable, that folks could not receive this in the mail. It was basically pornography, and that the post office objected to mailing out these copies of One. Now, the issue in particular, what did it contain? It contained, the post office objected to a story in the magazine called Sappho Remembered. And it was a story of a lesbian's affection for a 20-year-old girl. And this 20-year-old girl gives up her boyfriend to live with her lesbian lover because it was lustfully stimulating. And she had no other concerns about having a heterosexual life. So One magazine, instead of, and the people at Mattachine, instead of taking this this objection, laying down, as it were, they took it to court, and it made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a surprising objection to Olson's, the Postmaster General's objection to One magazine's Olson's idea that One magazine was actually pornography, objected to the Postmaster General's case, and it was declared that one magazine was not pornography and that it could be mailed out. So this had a huge implication on gay publishing. So gay magazines were now protected by free speech. And then 10 years later, the Stonewall riots happened, which set in motion the US gay rights movement. And during these decades, an underground gay and lesbian book scene flourished, which paved the way for the arrival of LGBT bookstores in America. So starting in the 70s, bookstores across the country started to pop up. And it was, you had in 1969, Manhattan's Oscar Wilde bookstore opened. You had, followed by Giovanni's Room in Philadelphia, followed by Washington, D.C.'s Lambda Rising, followed by San Francisco's A Different Light. And these bookstores responded to a growing need for community spaces for queer people outside of the bar scene that were quite liberating. So one of those bookstores, Lambda Rising in DC, was actually the focal point of Lambda, the organization creation. One of the owners of Lambda bookstore, Lambda Rising in DC, realized that there was no way for all of these bookstores to communicate with each other around what was being published. Now, there was no New York Times coverage, there was no internet. So the owner, L. Page Deacon, published the first Lambda book report, which was a compilation of books that were about to be released, to the best of his knowledge, that ran the gamut from everything from pulp fiction to literary fiction. And this publication was published basically between bookstores. And then this publication was actually released to the public for purchase. And people would, just like the One magazine, would write in to get these publications mailed to their houses. This led to what is now the Lambda literary website. We are kind of modeled off of what the Lambda book report was in 1987, only in the digital format. With that, in 1989, Lambda decided that since our books weren't being recognized by any kind of national literary awarding bodies, we started the Lambda Book Awards. And our first gala event honors went to writers such as Paul Monette, Dorothy Allison, Alana Hollinghurst, Edmund White. And the purpose of those awards in the early years was to identify and celebrate the best and LGBTQ books in their year of publication. And this was the first time that LGBT literature was given national visibility, and that LGBTQ literature, and the first time that LGBTQ literature was recognized as an established art form. And then in 2007, we started the Retreat, which is still the first residency for LGBTQ writers, just slowly dedicated to LGBTQ writers. And then in 2020, we started our Writers in Schools program. So that's kind of the history of Lambda. And I just want to reiterate, it comes from a need for community, and it came from actually bookstores. Because bookstores were one of the only places at the time where the LGBTQ community could meet outside of a bar. So that is kind of the history of our organization. But you know, when all of this stuff is going on, there's still a disconnect. So let's say in 1985, I was a junior in high school, and I had no idea any of this stuff was going on. These bookstores were springing up. You know, there was this whole lineage of LGBTQ literature, and I lived in New York, and I had no idea any of this was happening, that it was going on. And it just just before the internet, it just goes to show there was a real disconnect between some of the things that were happening in the LGBT community and what was going on in people's individual lives who did not have access to this information. But luckily what I did was I had access to the Village Voice, which was actually a popular alt weekly that ran in New York because my father bought it. But in the back of the Village Voice, there was something called a phone chat line. Now, I don't know if people remember this. I'm dating myself now. but it was a line where it's like an ad, like if you call in, you can talk to other like-minded men. And you call in and it costs I think $1 for the first minute and then 50 cents for the next additional minute. So of course I called it in high school constantly. And I ended up running a $1,000 phone bill. Not realizing that of course my parents would see this phone bill. So there I was, I got a call, I was in my, I was actually a freshman in high school. I got a call to come down to the nurse's office because my parents wanted to talk to me. And they took me home and they said, we just got this $1,000 phone bill and we called it. And, when you call the number, it would say, press 1 if you're a top and press 2 if you're a bottom. And that's the first thing my parents heard. And that's how I came up to my parents. And they said to me, you have to pay this phone bill back. So I got a job at the library to pay off the phone bill. And my delinquency continued because the first thing I did when I got a job at the library was discover there was something called gay books. And I stole all the books out of the library. And I'll be honest, I was only really stealing them for basically the sex scenes. I didn't even understand gay culture. I was just like, what's going on? But from reading this literature in high school that I stole, but now people don't have to steal books. Go to the library, take out your books, go to bookshop, purchase your books. I don't want to promote delinquency, but this is what I did when I was in high school. And I discovered this literature and found out how instructive it was. It was like these books were telling me how I could live a life. And what was fascinating about these books were they weren't describing what gayness was. They were describing life as they lived it. So it was this weird thing where it was kind of like, it was gay books for gay people that I happened to read. So it was really amazing. So I realized, okay, this is what I'm going to do. As soon as I turn 21, I'm going to the disco. As soon as I'm 21, I'm going to go to the gay and lesbian group. As soon as I turn 18, I'm doing this. So these books turned to be instructive. And that was my first kind of entryway into gay literature and the gay world, was through these books. And that's how I discovered the power of it. And I discovered I also wanted to be a writer. And that kind of led me on the path of where I am right now. And I didn't even know about Lambda at the time, which existed in the 80s, but this was before the internet. So now we're at this moment where this access has been opened up to basically everyone who has access to the internet in terms of getting LGBTQ literature. And I kind of, from these experiences, I learned about more in-depth parts of our history, and also some of the blind spots that the queer literary movement still has and had. Even when LGBTQ bookstores were at its most robust, there were still only certain type of narratives that were told, and these were mostly from cis white men and cis white lesbians. This was the culture that I came out to. There were Audre Lordes, there were James Baldwins, there were Elin Harris's, but unfortunately, a lot of what I saw were, it's a tale as old as time. It's like those who control the levers of power. And at those times, the levers of power of bookstore owners were white, cis writers. So those were the books that I was introduced to. So that's important to realize that even then, and even now, that is still the case. And some of what you're seeing now is the struggle and the pushback to that. Even within Lambda's organization, particularly around trans writing, Lambda for a long time really had a deficit in covering and elevating trans writers and disabled writers. So now we're trying to address these kind of blind spots and making sure that there's a seat at the table for all of our communities, particularly the ones who are right now most under siege. So that is kind of the history of Lambda and my participation to it, and kind of the history of what we can now probably consider LGBTQ literature. So at this point, what I want to do is, I guess what I want to do is take questions around, kind of where we're at, where we're going, what are folks seeing, what do folks want to see when we talk about LGBTQ literature.
Thanks so much for that, William.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, William. So for everyone who's here, Tyler and I are going to kind of stack the order of events, and we're going to ask a question each just to get sort of Q&A portion here started. But we want to invite everybody to contribute your own questions. So 2 ways to get your questions in the queue. The first is to use the hand raising feature on Zoom. If you haven't used this before, down the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a button for participants. If you click that participants button, it'll pop up a little menu, and then there's a button with 3 dots on it. If you click that, it will say raise hand. So you can use the raise hand function to get in the queue. The other way is just, you can post your question in chat, or just post, I have a question in chat. We will, Tyler and I will be working together to make sure that we get those. Okay, so resisting my temptation to ask all the new questions that I came up with during your speech there, William, I'm just going to start with kind of an open-ended question. What makes writing queer?
Well, there's kind of 2 things, right? There's subject matter and there's aesthetics. I'll start with aesthetics. I think what happens is whenever there's a group that is marginalized, they form their own way to communicate and to talk. That means everything from slang to subject matter to things they're interested in. And I think those aesthetics form queerness as an aesthetic. So that's, I think, one important key. And the definition of what that aesthetic is, I think, is always shifting depending on what's happening in the culture and how those marginalized communities talk or what they're interested in. But I think that is one example. We can see it in things like camp, which is a really kind of a queer aesthetic, which is this idea of insider outsideness, and kind of understanding the ridiculousness of life, but also taking it very seriously. It's definitely a queer aesthetic. And then there's something just around the subject matter, which is just queerness in action. So there could be novels that maybe don't contain that sense of aesthetics, but still have a firm grounding of like describing how people in their queer bodies move through the world, whether it's sex, desire, politics. Talking about those things has same gender loving or bi or trans. Those things also constitute queer literature. So it's both aesthetics and actually kind of material ways we move through the world, which is always changing. So to give like a concrete definition is hard.
That's great, William. So I want to touch on something that you got to at the end of your presentation. And so the question is, like, how do you see queer publishing and storytelling relating to the storytelling of other minority or marginalized communities, especially when there's so much intersectionality, right? People who are queer and Black and poor, or sort of all these various ways of being in the world. I was wondering if you just talk, like, are there particular pitfalls to focusing on queer writing? Are there certain possibilities that's opened up by sort of using that queer lens? And yeah, you just sort of like riff a bit on that space.
I mean, pitfalls in terms of, publishing is a separate beast because publishing is a commercial enterprise, which is different from art and is different from queer writing. So I think we should kind of make those distinctions. Publishing is a different thing. So are there pitfalls? There can be, in the sense that publishers want you to publish what they consider to be digestible to a quote unquote large mainstream audience. So that's one thing, which is different from actual art for writing. I think queerness is an expansive term. For me, there is something called like Black queerness, which I find the most exciting, which yet again has a set of slang and cultural touchstones, which I find exciting. And I also think, contrary to what a lot of publishers believe, that specificity is also exciting to a large group of readers and writers. You can see in some of the art that is like getting popular right now, that is infused with Black queerness, that is popular. So I think it's difficult to deal with corporate mandate, which is always going to be the case. But I do think that queerness is an expansive word, and that it incorporates a lot of different things. And those things I think, have always made for great, fertile art. I don't know if that directly answers your question.
Yeah.
But I think, that's the end of it. I mean, for me, the most interesting work is the specific and the queerness, even when it comes to like, a specific type from a different queer specific community, whether it's Latinx, whether it's African American, whether it's like that specificity always for me makes it much more interesting.
So I have a quick follow-up on that, which is about sort of your experience at Lambda Literary, because you're both, you're like a writer and a lover of literature, but you're also sort of in this like major internationally renowned organization. So can you talk a bit about so all the things that you just talked about, can you talk about sort of concretely how that struggle plays out when you're sort of in the belly of, I don't want to call Lambda Literary the beast, but sort of in the center of that publishing world that's fraught in all the ways that you talked about?
Well, I can talk from my personal experiences that, one of the experiences is that, like I said before, we all have our blind spots. So realizing that that queer literature goes beyond my particular aesthetics, and as a Black gay man, and making sure I incorporate that into the work we do. When I started Lambda, I didn't know a lot about lesbian romance novels, and I didn't know the history and the importance of the lineage of lesbian romance novels. So those are things like that I have to constantly overcome, because what's happening is that the queer community is always becoming expansive, and it is my job to understand how it's expanding, why, and why those expansions are important to incorporate in any of the work that we do. And then my second challenge is making sure the publishing industry understands that as well, and why it's important, and why it can actually sell books, and why it can. So that's key.
I had kind of a follow-up on this vaguely kind of like institutional structural kind of line as well. In your presentation, you mentioned that part of the power of this job at the library that you got, and sort of having access to queer literature for the first time, gave you insight into how you could live. And we know that for many younger people now, that social media platforms like Instagram are starting to fill that role for people, right? It's sort of another place where they can easily and for free access just, how do I even want to put it, like more possible paths in life, right? Different ways to be. But I know from actually a project that a student of mine worked on last semester about Instagram changing their sort of policing of what they considered to be obscene, that some of the shifting landscape around obscenity and policing content online sometimes has unintentional consequences for the LGBTQ+ community in particular, because of heteronormative assumptions behind what sharing sort of, obscene or pornographic content online does or is, sort of a narrow kind of understanding of the transformative power of accessing that kind of content. And I just wanted you to invite to share with us if you've had any other experiences of this sort, so like institutional, technically, right, it's like a gender and sexual preference and whatever labels we want to use, neutral policy, but it has potentially disproportionately negative effects for this community, exactly because trying to police online spaces in a way that is too narrowly concerned with pornography doesn't understand how expansive these new kinds of social media could be for people. Have there been other kinds of unexpected avenues and barriers that have come up with social media and how that's affected creative queer work in your experience?
Yeah, so in terms of social media or in terms of publishing, because in social media, yes. I mean, what I have to think about when I'm even composing a post for Lambda, I have to consider like, what image am I using for this book cover? There was a book cover recently, which was so well done. And I'm gonna see if I can put it in the chat, but I had to edit it out because I was worried that social media would deem it inappropriate. So yes, it does happen. And it's kind of the pitfalls of kind of like, having to navigate these spaces and kind of the importance to having kind of these books out there in the world. The issues always become is like, how do we share it? Because we all get our information now a lot from Facebook and from Instagram. So it has come up. It has been a problem. I think about it constantly in terms of the content, or how I position the content on the site. So you have this kind of problem where you're trying to navigate. I want to make sure people have access to this. I want to make sure readers have access to this information, but I also want to make sure that I can be able to share it so it won't get taken down. So I haven't quite figured out the kind of algorithm to do it all the time properly, but I'm working on it. But it comes up, it happens.
So Hannah and I have a lot of questions prepared, so we can just keep asking our questions. But I just want to, again, sort of give a shout out to the other attendees. If anyone has any questions, join in or raise your hand or chat. I just want to like hold a second in case anyone here sort of shyly had a question they want to ask. Okay, well, I'll keep going with my next question then. So William, I loved how you talked at the start about how, these queer stories that were being told in the 80s were revolutionary, but also quite narrow, like only certain kinds of queer stories were being told. I was wondering if you could just talk about what kind of queer stories you think are still struggling to be told, but are sort of slowly sort of emerging now, or being supported by publishing. And also, can you talk a bit about, are there like future queer imaginaries, untold, unimagined queer stories that you think are sort of on the horizon that maybe aren't even sort of in the sort of publishing realm yet, that you're sort of excited for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. Let me amend that to say that, there were stories being told, but I didn't necessarily have access to them. And I didn't have access to them because the people who controlled those levels of power weren't promoting them or elevating them. Later on, I mean, that's why I think archival work is so important, because there is this work that exists in the archives that we have to dig and find and look for, that were done in zines and small presses that never got big shout out. So they existed, but I didn't have access to them, and they weren't elevated in the way that a lot of kind of cis white narratives were. And for your second question around, sometimes my imagination is not as wide as some of these young writers are. So, but I will say, yes, I think writing about trans desire, I think is something that we're seeing a lot more of, and we need a lot more of. Work that is not just based on trauma, but based on pleasure, I think is what we will start to see, or need to see, and are going to begin to see. So those are some of the things that I think we're going to start to see that are going to probably be incorporated into the canon next. That's what's up. That's what I'm starting to see on the horizon. And also I'm starting to see some stuff around, which I think is also important, is in community conflict, and really talking about it in ways that's thoughtful and considerate. So, a lot of what happens is, like, when I talk to my other Black gay friends, our conflicts and our love is not about whiteness. It's about our interaction with ourselves. And those stories are important to talk about, and those stories are important to read. So I'm starting to see that on the horizon too.
Awesome, that's great.
Yeah, I second your optimistic vision there. As someone who was raised in a lesbian household, it's always been a struggle to get people to expand their understandings of what families are. And people have really a narrow view of what, I mean, honestly, they have no actual knowledge about what healthy families look like, right? But they've got plenty of opinions about somehow the incapability of you know, a two-parent household to raise a child successfully. So, Yvonne, I can see that you have a question, so I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, I just was wondering if you actually help writers find publishers or edit and define and redefine something that they're working on already.
Yes, we do. What's happening right now has Lambda, like everyone else, pivots online, is that we're starting to do a series of workshops specifically around queer publishing and craft. So, like, one thing we have up, I'm going to throw this in the chat, is one thing is a lot of queer writers don't understand how publishing as an industry actually works. So our first workshop is really about agenting, like how do you find an agent? How do you write a query letter? Why agents are important? What are advances? How do you actually make money from writing? Then after this, we're going to be doing a series of craft workshops based around actually helping your work be the best work that it can be. So yes, before these kind of workshops were done under the auspices of our retreat, but now we're being more expansive and we're offering these things online. Does that answer your question? Yes, so yes, we have an agenting workshop. There's no one will be turned away for the ability to pay, you know, so there's scholarships available. So if there's anyone interested, just email me, which is, I should put my email in the chat. And sign up for our newsletter so you can get more information around upcoming workshops. And there's my email.
That's good.
Any other questions from our audience at the moment? It's just like being in class, right? When I ask students if they got any questions, and I'm like, guys, silence feels even longer online.
Bueller, anyone.
I'm happy to wait. So the students, like, it feels even longer now than it does when we're sitting in a classroom. But I'm ready and willing. I want to hear what you guys have to say as well.
Can I ask the audience some questions? I have questions for the audience if I could.
Let's flip it around. Go for it.
I'm interested to know what the audience's relationship, like what was their first kind of acknowledgement or seeing queer literature, or their experience around queer literature as they move through the world?
You're going to make us repeat ourselves.
Well, so I can share. I'm happy to rip the Band-Aid off. I'll go first. So I guess what's interesting for me was I was kind of, you know, being raised in a queer household. Queerness was just kind of around, right? Like when we got a color printer at home for the first time, my mum was running some events at the university, right? I used my program to print off the little rainbow buttons that she could use at the event, you know, so it was a little bit different. But one of the things that's really stuck with me and has been my main engagement, and as some of you here know, given some of the khaki events, has been with feminist fairy tales and queer stories for children. And in part, this is because one of my mums, maybe unsurprisingly, did a dissertation on heteronormativity in early childhood education, so I had a very easy access to those kinds of books. But they're still one of my favorite places, especially if I'm having conversations with someone about these kind of topics, to give them a book that's kind of aimed at kids, right? Because it just brings so many of these deep and difficult questions just right at the, like, there's no escaping them in a kid's book, right? It's just, why is this person different? And am I wrong in treating them differently because of it, right? So I find those to be a really rich source. And that's, I guess, is my main connection, especially at the moment with queer literature and queer stories.
I think I'll go, Yvonne, you were gonna go. I'll go after you though. Are you sure? I kind of have a funny one. So this isn't literature per se, but it's stories. So when I was, gosh, I had to be like 3 years old, like 3, 4 years old. My mom would still rock me to sleep on her lap. at night, and she would watch PBS, so like public television, and late at night they would show like bizarre old wonderful English, like British TV. So there was this show called Are You Being Served, which if anybody knows the show, it's fabulous and I love it still. I haven't seen it in years, but I remember and of course, like this took me like my whole life to figure this out. This wasn't until recent years I realized like, hey, that I loved the character that was the gay man the most. And I like clung to him and I thought he was like amazing. And I remember specifically asking my mom, why is he like that? And I just like loved him and everything he did. I'd like wake up if I was going to sleep if he came on the screen. And she didn't tell me why. She said, oh, he's just different, you know? And I thought, I don't know, there's something more to that, I think, even as a child. But, and then of course it went on. I grew up I was in a pretty like religious and homeschooled household. So it wasn't until later in life when I started identifying these things for myself, and not until probably my junior year in college when I started reading, not through my classes, but through my friends at college, queer literature. And one that was really good was actually, and I bet you, William, you've seen this come up, is the graphic novels. So I read Fun Home, and it was given to me or introduced to me by a friend. And I remember I ordered it and it came to my mom's house here in Merced, and she was like appalled. Like, and I'm like 20 something at this point, and she knows like I'm out in the world doing whatever. And she's like, she literally named it. Like, this reminds me of everything you just said. She said, I think you got a book by mistake. It's something like a pornographic novel. And I was just like, Mom, this is not what you, but just kind of like hilarious, but not, because it uncovers so many of the layers of how this is not what's, you know, been deemed as normal. And so, and how that plays out in people's lives. So yeah, it's just like fascinating. So the more it's around, the more it opens a door for folks to explore that and explore it in themselves in ways that so many people aren't. So I just want to just say the work you're doing is so important and so great and amazing. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Hannah. And I want to say, you know, it's interesting, you know, because Alison Bechdel comes out of a tradition of queer bookstores and community, because before Fun Home, she had a cartoon, a comic strip that ran in independent queer newspapers called Dykes to Watch Out For. And queer independent publishing in terms of periodicals like newspapers kind of mirrors the trajectory of gay bookstores. So before, you know, Alison had access to publishing that book, she kind of built the groundwork by working through community presses. And we used to go and read Dykes to Watch Out For every week that I was in Boston at the time, so it was called Bay Windows, was the name of the gay newspaper. So it's so wonderful to see kind of this underground success that has now, she's like rightfully so, world-recognized cartoonist and graphic novelist. It's a great book. I'm glad that's the book. I'm sorry that someone thought it was pornographic. And if it is, it's only pornographic in the best way possible, so.
I agree. Don't worry, my mom's okay. I talked her down.
Okay, good.
I love that she really had to read through it, because it's not pornographic from page one, right? I think there's like one love scene. So she like clearly page by page, there must be porno in here somewhere.
Somewhere, yes.
So you just brought up gay bookstores, William, and sort of the physicality of those spaces, but you've also been talking about how Lambda Literary and the entire world has pivoted to virtual spaces. And we were chatting a bit about that before the start of today's meeting. I was wondering if you could just talk about, like, it's kind of like the what's lost and what's gained in this sort of virtual world, and sort of against a backdrop of a lot of bookstores closing, especially gay bookstores. So what sort of loss as those physical spaces are sadly disappearing?
You know, it's about, I mean, it's community. I mean, that sense of community, that kind of material connection is being lost, which is unfortunate. I mean, I was just reading just recently how just looking at the history of gay bookstores, one of the first feminist bookstores was called Amazon, which actually got in a lawsuit with Amazon around the name, even though Amazon, the feminist bookstore, existed first. So that's just an aside. But yeah, it's hard. But the flip side to that is that there's connections that can happen online that haven't been possible before, particularly for folks who are disabled, particularly folks that are in rural areas. I mean, it used to be like, to have queer community in a substantial way, people say, okay, I have to move to a coastal city. It doesn't have to be that way anymore. I've seen reading groups pop up online. So it's happening, but there is a loss. There is that need for communication in ways that feel a little bit more substantial than a Zoom. And I haven't quite figured out what that's going to look like yet. But it's hard, I think, how do we make our online spaces have more substantial connection? And if anyone have any ideas, I'll take them. Because I'm still trying to figure it out.
Steve, it's honestly, it's a research project that I'm working on, so I'll get back to you.
Okay, so get back to me. Let me know.
I'll get back to you. What I can say right now is that, the kind of all of the reasons that we like grassroots organizing offline also tends to lead to good communities online, right? When people sort of come together around a particular mission and a cause and can get that going. So maybe we can't rely on these like social media platforms to organically give us the outlets that people need. But, we can intentionally make smaller spaces either within them or in other platforms to get there. Yeah.
That's good.
I think this is a great question. I want if anybody else, Ivana, I think you had unmuted around the same time Hannah did to talk about your experience with queer literature. Veronica, I'm also going to call you out for with your comment here about loving Dykes to Watch Out For as another possible contributor here, sort of get some of your experience with queer lit on the table.
Well, for me, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay. For me, and obviously this is dating me as well, I came out and moved to San Francisco in the early 70s. So some of my first experience of gay literature was hanging out with Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, putting together the Daughters of Bilitis little paper folded newsletters or little pamphlets that we would send out that had poetry and little short stories and drawings and things like that. It was a very kind of local little publication, and we would meet upstairs in their loft, or I can't remember exactly where it was, and we would literally sit around the table and collate these things together. And that was like my first experience with gay literature as a late teen during that time. And then, of course, living in San Francisco, I got exposed to a lot more during that period of time. And when women's music came out, that was a big deal for me. Another form of literature in a way. And so it was like around in the early days of the coming out movement and the gay community. And also I just wanted to express, William, thank you for being here and sharing with us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Veronica. And those zines that you talk about are part of the archives that I think it's important that we always continue to remember and to elevate, because it's an important part of our history and helps us kind of understand how we got where we are today.
Absolutely.
Because it was those zines like Daughters, like The Ladder, like One's Magazine. Those were the foundations of a lot of what we consider queer literature today. Right. It came from a lot of staples and a lot of late night printing.
Yeah, I remember in high school, my teachers in their wisdom trying to give me some content that would help me flourish as the proto-queer person that I was. But they didn't, I mean, this was a Catholic high school in the suburbs of Canada. So the best they could do was like really sort of like crypto-queer, two best friends in a book that was otherwise, very not queer. And in some ways I was just like, I guess this is the realm of possibility for me. I'll have, a dude who's a best friend because those stories sort of in some ways define the horizon of my imagination. And then I remember getting to college and discovering all these incredible stories that were so far beyond anything I'd imagined in my, very, socially conservative suburban upbringing. Not socially conservative that was anti-gay, but just, picket fences and whatnot. And it was just so transformative, that discovery. And that discovery really happened in used bookstores. The really dusty, dark ones in particular, where I felt comfortable sort of browsing, furtively in the back corner, sort of a lesbian romance or whatever. And I really do miss those physical spaces because of that possibility of accidental discovery that I think the internet lacks a bit.
Right. Well, it's true. But yeah, I will say that I have discovered some things online that like some literature, like, oh my God, how did I miss this? Or like, there was, even things that, there's a, maybe like 2 years ago, there's a Gordon Merritt was a best-selling gay author who wrote explicitly gay books in the 70s, bestseller, millions and millions of copies. And now no one knows anything about him. If you want to Google, I think Gordon Merritt, I think he wrote a book called, see if I can find it, The Lord Won't Mind. And the covers were outrageous. It was like men lounging in like on Greek Isles, and they were really popular. So it's like, oh, this existed. So I will say that I still can get every once in a while, but yes, to like the physical spaces, that's how we kind of, especially looking at book covers, is how we discover it. And you also mentioned something about subtext, like as when you were young, you were getting books, and it was like your subtext was your entryway into kind of finding little hints of queerness in some of the books you were given. Do you remember what the books were that had that subtext in it?
So I remember one. I mean, this actually has two men having sex in it, but it was Timothy Finley's The Wars. Timothy Finley's a Canadian novelist. Really not sort of queer in any of the ways that you talked about. So not queer in sort of aesthetic or affect, not really queer in terms of content, but two guys had sex. And so my teacher was like, you should probably read this. They're like, two cowboys had sex secretly. I was just like, thank you.
Which I think is important. For me, it was like subtext there's a point where subtext is all we have. Subtext is all some folks have. And that's important, kind of like subtext and kind of, for me, it was like reading the separate piece. Do people still read the separate piece in high school? It was a book by John Knowles about two boys who had a really kind of dramatic relationship in high school. And that was for me, like, I was riveted by that book. Now I know why I was riveted. But in the end, it was all subtext. And in the end, John Knowles turned out to be gay, so it all made sense. But, this is part of my English, the English canon for my high school to read.
We are kind of starting to approach the end of our hour, unfortunately. But Tyler, do you think we're ready for that last question we've got on our list, or?
Sure, unless there's a final burning question from the other attendees. Yeah, but yeah, so maybe go for it.
I'm so curious to know, like on a grassroots level, what your thoughts are of how to get literature out to young people, because I think this is still an issue today and in so many places. And I guess, of course, there is the internet now, but I still think it's, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, one thing we're doing is working with the school system. So, I mean, that's big. But that obviously is not possible in every single state. So one of the ways that we try to do it is work with people. I mean, every community, there's folks who are doing grassroots work on the ground. So instead of us going in and saying, we're gonna give out we work with community stakeholders who always exist. In most communities, there are and follow their lead around what's best practices around getting information around these books and this literature out within your community. So that's one way we do. We look for stakeholders and we ask them, in your specific community, what's the best way to make sure that kids have access to these books if they need them or if they want them, which they do. So that's one way we do it. But I'm also finding that, kids are savvy on the internet these days around finding books. I mean, my niece is out and queer, and she finds YA books sometimes before I do. They know, they have networks. There's like Bookstagram, which is a huge thing. There's LGBTQ like book TikTok. I mean, there's things, and I don't have a TikTok account, so I'm like divorced from that world, but it's happening. The kids are doing it in ways that outreach that stretch farther than my imagination. So they're doing it. I mean, one way that we try to do is like to try to, offer support for people who are on those platforms and doing the work already.
Yeah, so I guess, Hannah, you've kind of preempted half of our last question here. So let me put it a sort of more, maybe just within, say, at the university context where a lot of us are learning, working, engaging with, as CACI's mission, right, to try and engage with the LGBTQ plus community on campus. Do you have specific advice for this community operating at this level about what we can do to try to help encourage queer voices on our campus, be that students, faculty, or staff? Because we have, where CACI at least is trying to work at all of those levels, and we would invite any suggestions to help us further in our own mission of getting queer voices heard on campus.
It's kind of like it's kind of like a two-prong attack. It's like one, working with the administration, and depending on who your administration is, it seems like you have a very kind of enlightened and forward-thinking administration, in terms of within your university system. So that's one thing that's important. And also working with people, like I said before, who are on the ground and maybe in some capacity have an interest in doing this work or already are doing the work. And doing the kind of the work of coalition building and opening up channels of communication between the administration and the people on the ground who want to kind of do this work and make sure that queer voices are centered.
Amazing. Thank you so much, William. So just a huge thank you to you. And then I think Onar has the final words of thanks and maybe some words about what's happening next month.
Yes, again, William, thank you so much, and for all the members of CACI to provide this space. It is so much critical. We are in a virtual world, but hopefully when we do come back to campus in person, that we are able to bring you to campus, William, as this is, this form of art, this writing, spoken word, right? It's our way of our resistance. So just really want to thank everyone for coming. And as you know, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion has sponsored a lot of virtual sessions, different topics, but also wanting to let everyone know on November, let me see, make sure I got this correct. Where did I write it? I was writing so many notes. There will be an open house for the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And if you go to diversity.ucmerced.edu, that's where it will be November 5th from 1 to 4 p.m. And part of the structure, and Desiree, correct me if I'm wrong, is because there's so many different working groups and committees to ensure that our scholars, faculty, staff, and admin provides a very inclusive sense of belonging community that is grounded in equity and social justice, that those working committee are asked to provide some feedback and updates in terms of the good work that they're doing. So that is November 5th from 1 to 4. And they do need to register, right? So yeah, so there will be more. And of course, as we know that it is also election season, the Office of Social Justice Initiatives and Identity Programs, we will be providing spaces. We're calling it the Radical Healing Spaces. There's a couple prior to the election, the night of the election, and a couple more after the election. So keep a lookout for that. That is in collaboration, co-sponsorship with the Dean of Students, and of course, also with Danya's office. So again, just really want to thank everyone for coming and sharing the space. Some great stuff. William and Kaki, thank you so much. We will be using all of your information and links because we have some great talented scholars and very creative ones that will be definitely will be beneficial to have this contact. So again, thank you in advance because I'm sure they will be reaching out to you.
Reach out, please do.
Great.
Amazing.
So
Thanks,
again,
everyone.
so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Kia ora, everyone. Thanks for coming.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.